Good morning. First, I'd like to welcome Charlie and Bob back from their long trip yesterday. This morning we have an on-the-record single-subject briefing with Mr. Alan Liotta, who is the Deputy Director of the Defense Prisoner of War Missing in Action Office. He will bring us up to date on facts surrounding the agreement we reached last night with the DPRK concerning the humanitarian efforts on POW MIA remains in Korea. And he'll have a short statement and then take your questions. Alan?
Morning. As most of you know, we successfully concluded an agreement with the DPRK yesterday for the recovery and compensation of remains of U.S. servicemen who have been missing from the Korean conflict. There are two principal objectives that were achieved by this agreement which we reached. The first is we resolved an issue of compensation for remains which had been returned to us in 1993 and 94. There were 162 sets of remains whose compensation had been in question. This had been an issue of discussion for quite some time, and it had been a stumbling block in us being able to have broader discussions with the North Koreans on recovery efforts within the country. And the second part of the agreement was a agreement that we would begin serious discussions with an expectation of beginning to launch joint recovery operations in North Korea this year. The first step in that will be a meeting in the first half of June, which will be used to outline all of the particulars, the logistical requirements, and come to an agreement on a site and how we will conduct the joint recovery operation. We see this as a very positive step forward on this humanitarian issue. It's something that we've been working on with the North Koreans through the United Nations Command and then directly with them since January in an effort to try and resolve the issue. We've kept our South Korean allies very closely in touch and working with them as we move forward on this, and have appreciated their support for this humanitarian effort that we've been engaged in. And we've seen this as a positive development, and responses we've received in my office so far from families and veterans groups also have been very supportive and are very pleased with the developments as they took place in New York. That's the end of my prepared comments. I'd be glad to take any questions. Yes?
This would be the first joint search, would it not? Weren't the earlier remains just handed over by the North Koreans, or was that? This would be the first joint search.
This would be the first joint recovery search, yes.
And have you a particular site in mind, and where would that be?
We do not have no particular sites in mind at this time. We've begun in my office to prepare some sites that we would like to propose, and the June meeting will be used for both sides to discuss the sites and hopefully to determine what sites we'd go to first.
Sir, the North Koreans had been linking this issue, the joint recovery issue, with bilateral talks with the United States on a peace treaty. Has that come up this time, or do you now consider that to be no longer a problem or an issue? The connection there.
In these talks, both in the talks in January in Hawaii, and then these talks, which were a continuation of the talks in Hawaii, we never discussed issues outside of this single issue. This is my office's portfolio, is the POW-MIA issue, and so we talked only in that context. And we did not get into any discussion about the President's proposal or any other bilateral initiatives that go on between the United States and DPRK.
And my point is that they were saying, up until now, as I understood it, they were saying there will be no joint recovery operations until the United States agrees to have peace talks directly with North Korea. So as far as you understand, there's no connection? It was even raised?
Yeah, they've never expressed such a concern to us. When former President Carter traveled to North Korea, then President Kim Il-sung had expressed a desire or said a willingness for North Korea to engage in joint recovery operations. That was the first time that we had heard them express such a willingness, and we had pursued it with them since then, using the former President Kim's words that in fact that they're willing to do that. And but they've never, in any talks with us, they've never maintained such a linkage.
Well, go ahead, Charlie. Sorry, I was just trying to clear up where, and do you know where and exactly when the talks, the June talks?
The June talks? No, the venue and the specific date have yet to be determined.
Will this joint operation involve a substantial number of U.S. military personnel going into North Korea? Will they have South Koreans with them? What are the logistics?
Our expectation is that we will conduct this operation the same way we do operations jointly worldwide. It will probably be a small team somewhere between 6 to 8 or 10 Americans, and there will be specialists involved in this type of recovery work, as well as mortuary affairs specialists and other specialists that we might need. If it's an aircraft site, for example, that has a potential of unexploded ordnance, then we would have an explosive ordnance specialist with us for safety reasons.
Those will all be military personnel in uniform?
They typically do not work in uniform. They work in civilian clothes because of the nature of the sites that they're doing, but it would be military personnel, yes. The Department of the Army, through the Central Identification Laboratory, runs all of these types of operations, and that would be the people responsible.
Would there be South Koreans with them?
We haven't gotten yet to planning. My expectation is probably not, but we haven't yet sat down to plan these operations. We typically, when we operate worldwide, only have U.S. personnel involved in the operations.
Your interlocutors in New York and in Hawaii, are they North Korean military or North Korean civilians?
The North Korean delegation was a mixed delegation. They had both Ministry of Defense and Foreign Ministry personnel on their delegations, and so that helped the talks because we had all the relevant and important people at the table to make sure that everyone was on board with agreements.
How many missing are we talking about here, sir?
There are currently over 8,100 unaccounted for U.S. servicemen from Korea.
Do you have any expectations of how many you might recover in this effort?
No, I can't say on this effort because it will determine on the site. We have a number of different kinds of sites that we could go to. We could go, for example, to a former POW camp where we know American servicemen were buried that died in the camp. We could go to known crash sites where we lost aviators to excavate a crash site. There are other places where we know of burial sites of individuals. Some are in mass graves where we would have a potential for a large number of recoveries, and some are more isolated graves. So there's a lot of different sites that we can pick and choose from. What we want to try to demonstrate is a site that we will have a very good chance of making a positive recovery and subsequently an identification of the remains when we bring back to show to the North Koreans that this is a positive step and that we can indeed accomplish the goal that we're after, and that is the return of these Americans back to the United States and to their families for burial with honors.
Yes, can you explain why in the statement you had a statement that was released yesterday, you specifically mentioned that the $2 million compensation was not to be a precedent. Was there any discussions about sort of the price that it's going to cost us in the future to recover more bodies?
No, what that was actually is a reflection of part of the problem which we had in the past, and that was we had paid compensation for some of the earlier sets of remains that they had returned to us, and those costs were based on what we deemed to be fair and reasonable costs for the nature of the recoveries. They then wanted to use the costs of those per sets of remains, shall we say, for the subsequent set of returns, not going by a fair and reasonable estimate, which is how we do our basis. One of the benefits of joint recovery operations is that because we'll be in the country, we'll be able to get an accurate reflection of costs for reimbursement if there's reimbursements to be associated. But that for the fact of when we're not in there, we can't get a accurate representation. And so it's fair. We base it on fair and reasonable, and that's where the disagreement came into play.
On their searches that they conducted themselves in the early 90s, you talked about 162 sets of remains. I've heard some reports that their performance in this area was rather poor and that there were only a few actual sets that were probably U.S. servicemen. Can you discuss that?
The remains which were returned to us, the Central Identification Laboratory has reviewed those remains, and we have not been we've only positively identified 5 sets of remains. And that was one of the reasons that we wanted to impress upon our North Korean interlocutors for a need for joint recovery operations. Their recovery techniques were not allowing us to make positive identifications. The reason we had the first set of negotiations on this issue in Hawaii was so that we could bring them to the Central Identification Laboratory, and they had one of their senior scientists as a member of their delegation at the time, so that we could have an honest exchange in showing them the recovery techniques which we use, the identification techniques which we use, and the strict legal constraints that the United States government is under when we conduct an identification process, to give them a broader understanding of that process as it works. Our hope then is that as we move into joint recovery operations using our techniques in conjunction with some of their techniques, we will be able to recover remains and then be able to have a much higher identification rate when we bring them back to the United States because we've been involved in the recovery process.
What's the maximum number you think could be recovered, sets of remains?
That's a difficult question to answer, having not been on the ground in the country. Our expectation is that we will not be able to recover all 8,100.
Well, 800
but
of them Hawaii.
That's correct. So our guess would be that somewhere probably around 3,000 to 4,000 would be an accurate representation of what we could do. That number, of course, may change once we get onto the ground in North Korea and we're able to draw an assessment from the actual scene.
How long is the team going to be in North Korea, and will they have their own security detail with them?
Hasn't been determined yet. Those are all things which will be discussed at the June meeting. Yes.
At the June meeting, are you going to be talking about just one site, or are you going to lay out a list of sites?
We would hope to be able to discuss a variety of sites. We don't have any idea yet of what kind of sites they're thinking about, so we will be prepared to discuss several kinds of sites. The expectation would be, depending on the site and the length of time, we would hope that we'd be able to conduct more than one joint operation before the end of the year.
Has there been any discussion whether the North Koreans have recovered already by themselves any additional remains that haven't been returned?
Well, I don't know if they have any more that they have not turned over to us. We have not talked about that with them, whether they have. We didn't ask them that as we tried to resolve this. Because we were focused primarily on resolving the compensation issue, which focused then on could we ask any other questions. Once that was resolved, we wanted to begin the joint recovery. This is an issue where we've been trying to build trust and confidence in both sides, and as we build the trust and confidence, we'll have an opportunity to go forward to get a better understanding of exactly what they do have and don't have. Obviously, if they do have some recovered remains that they have not yet turned over to us, we'd be welcome to receive those, and we would hope that they'd turn them over to us right away. Those would be simple turnovers. Problem would be, though, however, in the recovery techniques which they use, whether we'd be able to identify them or not.
Compensating them for those?
We would, if there was remains that they turned over to us, we would have a discussion with them on appropriate compensation for those. Yes.
Yes, my impression of the announcement is there is quite much concession by the North Korea, especially regarding the compensation amount of money. And did you find any flexibility of the change of attitude of North Korean militaries regarding this meeting?
I think that the success in New York came clearly from the negotiations which took place in Hawaii in January, which, as you'll recall, those negotiations broke off after we'd come to largely an impasse on the issue. I think what happened in Hawaii is that they had a very clear understanding of the United States position and where we stood on this, and what we were willing to do or not do. And in the ensuing months, they came back to New York and prepared to negotiate with us, and that both sides were able to craft an agreement that was mutually beneficial.
And I'm asking the interpretation of U.S. side of North Korea's position in the meeting, that which means North Korea probably interpret this agreement to be a potential high-level meeting between two militaries.
It would be unfair to comment on what their expectations were on the meeting. It's one of the things that's coming out of this is not going to be a high-level talk. I mean, if we begin a joint operations, joint recovery operations, it would be by the level of personnel which we used worldwide, and that's not generally officers level type of personnel. Yes.
Can you discuss a little bit how you came to the amount of $2 million for compensation?
The amount of $2 million was what we determined to be fair and reasonable expenses that would be associated with the recovery of the 162 sets of remains. Number of factors involved with that, but including the recovery sites from where they told us these remains had come from, the kinds of initiative and efforts which they had undertaken to recover those sets of remains.
And did the U.S. side propose this, and we've just waited then for the North Koreans to accept?
That's right. This offer, the $2 million was proposed to them in Hawaii as part of the Hawaii talks.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much.